Okay, lecture 15 here for chapter 9. We are going to talk about some special ways that your skeletal muscle cells, those muscle fibers, obtain, store energy to support the contractions that they need to do. All right, so a few things here about muscle metabolism, the energy that they need. They need ATP. Okay, ATP is the only source of energy that's used for contractile activities. Okay, so you need it for the cross bridging. You need it for pumping calcium back into the SR. For storage. You need it to run those sodium potassium pumps that are so important for helping you maintain your resting membrane potentials. So ATP is extremely critical, and muscles are going to bust through a lot of that. And be sure you review, go back and review the cross-bridging story and how ATP was used there. You need ATP to make your myosin heads come off of the actin fibers, and then when the ATP gets split, the myosin heads do the cocking, and then they rebind, and then you have your power stroke. So be sure you review and are familiar with that particular story. All right, so this is interesting. So you always have lots of ATP molecules floating around in a muscle fiber, but if you look here, they're used up in about 4 to 6 seconds, so very quickly, because they bust through it so quickly. All right, so muscle fibers have to regenerate ATP all the time, and they've got some options for doing that. 3 major options. One of those is aerobic respiration. So that's what we learned about before. Cellular respiration process. Aerobic means that it requires oxygen gas. You need oxygen gas for the very last chemical reaction of the electron transport chain part of cellular respiration. And this is what you do to get the most bang for your buck. So for every glucose or other type of nutrient molecule you're breaking down by cellular respiration, if you do it aerobically involving O2, you're going to make the most ATP. You're going to be able to harness as much energy as possible. There is an alternative, a couple of alternatives though, and one of those is called the anaerobic pathway. Anaerobic means without O2. It's a process called glycolysis. Glycolysis also happens in cellular respiration, but if you do this anaerobic pathway, as you'll see, you stop after glycolysis. You don't make as much ATP as we'll see, but you can do this very quickly. And then a third way is that there are molecules inside your muscle fibers called creatine phosphate, or CP. And so those are molecules that have phosphates, inorganic phosphates, bonded to them, and those phosphates can actually be transferred over to ADP to quickly help you make some ATP without going through cellular respiration or without going through this anaerobic pathway that we're about to talk about. All right, so just to review a little bit about good old ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is what adenosine triphosphate looks like. And there's our adenosine portion. That's an adenine nitrogenous base, or an A. And then you've got a ribose sugar, and then that is linked to 1, 2, 3 phosphates are attached on there. And this is a very high energy bond there. There's lots of energy stored between those 2 phosphates. All right, so this is ATP. When ATP gets split to ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, plus your inorganic phosphate, when that bond gets broken, that gives off lots of energy. Energy is released, and that's used to power things that cells do that requires work. All right, so how do we make this ATP in the first place? Where does this come from? Well, cells always have ADP molecules and those inorganic phosphate molecules floating around inside the intracellular fluids, and they're kind of like rechargeable batteries. So as you break down your nutrients from catabolic reactions, you break down things like glucose and fats and things like that. Some of that energy gets harnessed and it's used to bond ADP and phosphate together. Okay, because this is an anabolic reaction when you take ADP and phosphate and put those together to make ATP. You got to have energy to put those two together. Where are you getting your energy from? You're getting it from breaking down your nutrients like glucose. Okay, and so now you have those ATP molecules, and then those get broken apart again whenever a cell needs to do work. So when our skeletal muscle fibers want to contract, they're going to have to break those ATP molecules, hydrolyze them in order to extract that stored energy to power the contraction that they're going to do. And just a little bit of a review. This is a review of cellular respiration. Again, this is an aerobic process. An aerobic here is referring to O2, oxygen gas molecules. Those are required to run this process. And as we learned back in Unit 2, and if you need to, go back and re-review the information from Unit 2 about cellular respiration. We talked about how there are 3 major phases of cellular respiration. There's a set of chemical reactions called glycolysis that happens in the cytoplasm. And during that process, glucose is split into 2 pyruvate molecules. So glucose has 6 carbons in it. Pyruvate molecules have 3 carbons in them. So essentially the glucose is getting split apart. It's a multi-step process that involves about 10 different enzymes. But that's what occurs in that particular phase. You're partially breaking down your glucose. That happens in the cytosol, in the fluid in the cytoplasm. All right, so starting from glucose, over here, starting from glucose, you're going to get about 2 new ATP molecules by running glycolysis on glucose. And of course, this is happening to gazillions of glucose molecules all at the same time. All right, so that's not a lot of ATP. So if you want to generate more ATP, which typically cells are going to have to do if we're going to stay alive, the pyruvates there that you made from glucose, and you have 2 of those, they enter your mitochondria, those little powerhouse organelles in your cells, and then they enter a phase called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle is another name for that. And that is also going to generate 2 new ATPs for you. And then finally, there's another phase called the electron transport chain, which is where a lot of the energy actually gets harnessed from the glucose that was broken down. And so there you wind up with, we'll say, about 28 ATPs or so by running that set of events. It's not always exactly this number, but ideally you probably get about 28 or so per glucose by running that particular phase. All right, this is the phase where oxygen is used. O2 is used for the very last chemical reaction in the electron transport chain. And if you eliminate oxygen gas, so if you don't have oxygen gas around, you can't run this, and it actually also shuts down the Krebs cycle. So what's going to happen to your ATP amounts you're making? If you don't have O2 around, you're not getting those, and you're not getting those. You can still get these because this first phase over here does not require oxygen gas. So this is actually, glycolysis is said to be anaerobic. Now our cells cannot stay alive on a long-term basis by doing anaerobic processes, because you only get 2 ATPs for every glucose you're breaking down. That's not enough to power all the things that cells have to do. But as we'll see, your skeletal muscle fibers can do that temporarily to very rapidly generate some ATP to help you get through a period of intense exercise when you need a short period of very forceful contractions. All right, so just to kind of review, when you do the aerobic pathway, and that's cellular respiration, O2 is required. You do all of those phases of cellular respiration, all those chemical reactions. You're involving lots of enzymes to make that happen. You're going to get your maximum amount of ATP. This is what happens at rest. As you know, you have some tone in your skeletal muscles, so they're always doing some of that cross bridging to help them maintain their tone. And when you're doing light to moderate exercise. Where do they get their fuel? You've got glucose from the blood. Glycogen is stored in your skeletal muscles. What is glycogen? Glycogen molecules are just chains of glucoses that are bonded together. It's actually a type of starch. And you have these in your skeletal muscle fibers. You also have them in your liver. You may hear about people who do endurance running, like run marathons or do triathlons. You may hear them talk about building up their glycogen stores in their muscles, because the more glycogen they have, they'll eat lots and lots and lots of carbohydrates just before an event, carbo loading, and that helps them, or is thought to help them increase the amount of glycogen they have stored in their muscles. And so your skeletal muscles, when they need more glucose, they break the bonds here in the glycogen, and now you have free glucose molecules that you can funnel over into cellular respiration. Pyruvic acid, so you make that from glycolysis, or if it comes from other sources, it can funnel into your cellular respiration in the mitochondria and help you make ATP. Also, your fatty acids. You guys know that fats are energy sources, and those also funnel into the parts of cellular respiration that happen in your mitochondria. That's how you wind up extracting energy from fatty acids. Okay, so that's where your skeletal muscles, the chemical molecules that they have to break down for cellular respiration, that's where they come from. In addition to your fatty acids, this diagram is kind of providing an overview for you of what I was just talking about. Aerobic cellular respiration happens in your mitochondria, and it requires O2. You've got to have O2 as an input to make that happen. Fatty acids, this is what they're showing you over here. Fatty acids, you also can get energy from amino acids from your proteins. You guys know you can get energy from proteins. Those go directly to the mitochondria, and they feed into the Krebs cycle phase of cellular respiration. But that's the part where you the things that happen in the mitochondria where you get most of your ATP. So you can still extract plenty of energy from those. What are your outputs of aerobic cellular respiration? CO2. This is where your CO2 comes from. That's always important to keep in mind. The carbons in the CO2 are coming from the glucose or these other nutrients you're breaking down. Those are all carbon-based nutrients. The carbons, after those molecules get chopped up, they're actually present in CO2 molecules. CO2 is a waste that our cells give off. That's something you need to know and keep in mind for biology 202. That's going to come up pretty frequently. CO2. CO2 is a very important waste. It affects the pH of your body fluids, and that's why it's so critical and will come up for you a lot in biology 202. Water is actually an output. The O2s in the mitochondria actually get converted to water molecules at the end of cellular respiration. And then if you do this for every glucose, you can make 2 new ATPs. So you get 2 during glycolysis, 2 more during the Krebs, and then you can get 28 by running the electron transport chain if everything runs optimally. Now notice over here, the first phase where you take glucose and convert it to pyruvic acid, that's glycolysis. That happens in the cytosol, not in the mitochondria, and you don't need O2 to make that happen. That's anaerobic as we just talked about. All right, so what about anaerobic pathway? So what if you're doing glycolysis only? Okay, so you don't do the events in the mitochondria. All right, so when you are at about 70% of maximum contraction force in a skeletal muscle, your muscles are bulging. As you guys know, they get bigger. They squeeze on your blood vessels. Your blood vessels are what are bringing oxygen to your skeletal muscles. So guess what? That's going to limit your ability to do cellular respiration if you don't have oxygen gas. And so what happens instead, you run this anaerobic pathway. You do glycolysis only. Okay, so you're only getting per glucose 2 new ATPs. And then in order to be able to continue to run glycolysis and generate at least some ATP to support your muscle contractions, the pyruvic acid, that's your output from glycolysis, gets converted to lactic acid. Lactic acid, this is a waste from this anaerobic pathway. And then it gets out into the bloodstream. Actually, it can be used as a fuel by the liver and the kidneys and the heart. What they do is the liver will convert it back into pyruvic acid, so it can actually do the reverse and take that lactic acid waste and convert it back into pyruvic acid. And once you have pyruvic acid again, pyruvic acid can be used for a number of different things, but it's going to funnel right back into cellular respiration, so you can use that for energy. All right, so here's a little diagram of the anaerobic pathway. So again, if a skeletal muscle is doing the anaerobic pathway, glucose, which is coming from either breaking down glycogen you have stored in the muscle, or glucose that was delivered from the blood before the blood vessels got all compressed. You do a series of chemical reactions to split the glucose into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. You'll have 2 per glucose that get made. You're only getting 2 new ATPs for every glucose you break down. So you're not going to this is not going to support muscle contraction for a long period of time. And then those pyruvic acids get converted into lactic acid, so that is a waste. And then that gets into the bloodstream. All right, so it's going to get into the blood, get into your other body fluids as well. Does not require oxygen. Duration, how long can this last? About 60 seconds. So you're not getting very many ATPs for every glucose you break down, but this happens fast. This happens very quickly. All that rigmarole of cellular respiration takes a whole lot longer. Just keep in mind our time clock here, though, is down at the molecule scale. So we're all of these things, both cellular respiration and the anaerobic pathway, are happening in the blink of an eye. But we're talking about a super fast blink of an eye versus a super fast blink of an eye, I guess, is what we're trying to distinguish here. All right, so when would you use that anaerobic pathway? If you're running a sprint, or if you're lifting a really heavy weight and the blood supply to the muscle gets cut off, and you've got to generate ATP quickly, you'll use that anaerobic pathway. That's why you can't sprint for very long. You can only sprint for so long, and then your muscle fatigues and you can't do it anymore. That's why you can't indefinitely handle a heavy weight. Eventually you're not gonna be able to run that anaerobic pathway any longer, and you're gonna wind up dropping the weight. Also, think about the burn you feel from running a sprint or holding a heavy weight for a long period of time. That burn is actually coming from the lactic acid. The lactic acid gets released as a waste from the muscle fibers, and it irritates sensory nerves that respond to or generate pain signals, or send pain signals to the brain so that you perceive pain. And that's actually due to the lactic acid buildup that's occurring. Okay, a third way that skeletal muscles can make ATP is called direct phosphorylation. So phosphorylation is another um, term for taking a phosphate and bonding it to ADP, or taking a phosphate and bonding it to another type of molecule. It's called phosphorylation. Okay, so skeletal muscle fibers have inside them a molecule called creatine phosphate, abbreviated here as CP. So there's a molecule called creatine. It's an organic molecule, and it has a phosphate attached to it, a phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygens. And then inside your skeletal muscle fibers, you have ADP, and so we need those to bond to phosphates, which you can do through the anaerobic pathway or aerobic cellular respiration, or they can also steal the phosphates off of the creatine. Those can be transferred to the ADP, and so now you have ATP and you have free creatine. Now later, when you're not using the muscle anymore, the reverse can happen, and those phosphates can actually be transferred back onto the creatine so that you remake CP, creatine phosphate. So that's another, creatine phosphate is an energy storage molecule, and it's another way for your skeletal muscle fibers to be prepared to generate ATP very quickly when they need to. You can run a typical skeletal muscle for about 15 seconds just off of their CP stores. So for about 15 seconds, you can generate enough ATP by stealing phosphates from creatine phosphate to run a typical skeletal muscle. This does not require oxygen, so this is something else you can do anaerobically. You may have heard of people before taking creatine supplements. The idea there being if you can get more creatine into your skeletal muscles, apparently skeletal muscle cells will uptake creatine molecules that you take in from your diet. The idea there is that they'll be able to store more phosphates, and they'll be able to make more ATP molecules by doing that. And apparently that is something that a lot of these supplement things you hear about are kind of sketchy in terms of the science behind them, but apparently this one does actually seem to have some credibility behind it. It also causes some of the bodybuilders like it as well, because creatine is an organic hydrophilic molecule, so it actually absorbs water, and so your muscles take up water and they'll actually increase in size. You'll notice some increase in muscle size if you take a creatine supplement. There's also a waste that's generated from creatine called creatinine. So that's creatine, take off the E and add an INE on the end. Creatinine is a waste product that's made from creatine, and if you're suffering muscle damage, you'll have elevated levels of creatinine in your bloodstream. Or if you have heart damage, like after a heart attack, you may have elevated levels of creatinine in your blood supply as well. Your kidneys filter that out and you pee out any creatinine. That's one of the wastes that you urinate out of the body. So sometimes they look for that too when they're checking for proper kidney function. If your kidneys are not functioning properly, you will not eliminate the creatinine out of your blood properly. And so sometimes they'll run a creatinine test to see if your kidneys are functioning properly and doing their jobs properly. You may have heard of that creatinine test before. Okay, I like this graphic because it's showing you what happens during short duration exercise versus prolonged duration exercise. Let's say you're doing something for a short period of time, like running a sprint. So this is kind of cool. For 6 seconds, you're going to use up the ATP you've already got floating around inside that skeletal muscle fiber. So it's going to be used for helping that cross bridging taking place. And then for about the next 10 seconds or so, you're going to steal phosphates off of creatinine phosphate, transfer those over to ADP to make you some new ATP. That'll last you for about 10 seconds. And then for about the next 30 to 40 seconds, you're going to use the glycogen you have stored in your skeletal muscles, break it down to glucose, and then that glucose is going to be oxidized. Here is another term essentially for catabolizing or breaking down the glucose, and you're going to generate your ATP that way. That's what would happen if you were just, running for a short period of time. Now, what about long duration exercise? You're going to have to keep running cellular respiration over and over and over and over and over again. You've got to keep making ATP. So for long duration exercise, like if you're running several miles or a marathon, something like that, you got to keep doing aerobic cellular respiration. To help you generate more and more and more ATP. Now, you guys know if you're running a long distance, you can't run as quickly as you can for a short distance, and that's because the amount of ATP you're generating is limited. There's only so much ATP you can crank out by doing all of that rigmarole with aerobic cellular respiration. So the amount of contraction force you can generate is not going to be as much as if you're doing the anaerobic method, which is much faster, but which gets wiped out pretty quickly. And I know on that diagram they're mentioning myoglobin. I'm going to talk about myoglobin a little bit on the next video lecture. All right, muscle fatigue. What happens when your muscles get tired and you can no longer use them? They lose the ability to contract. And how does this occur? Eventually you wind up with imbalances of potassium, calcium ions, inorganic phosphate, and if you don't have those ions around at their proper levels, that's going to interfere with your EC coupling, excitation contraction coupling. Interestingly too, long periods of exercise actually damage the SR in your muscles, and so that causes problems with calcium regulation and release. It's unusual for your skeletal muscle fibers to totally run out of ATP. That would be highly unlikely to occur. But think about what happens like if you have a muscle cramp. If your muscles get super exhausted, they can cramp up, and those types of things can occur due to ionic imbalances. But if you have low ATP levels, muscles can remain in almost like a permanent state of contraction, continuous contraction for a period of time. And so why is that? If we think back to the cross bridging that takes place, where you've got a actin filament and here you've got the myosin heads that are attached. If you guys remember, you need ATP to bind to those myosin heads so that they'll actually detach. And then the myosin heads get cocked when ATP gets broken down into ADP and phosphate. You need that to happen. So if you, when you have low ATP levels in your skeletal muscle cells, it can make it difficult for those myosin heads to come off. They stay attached, and you can actually have a continuous contraction taking place, and you might experience that as cramping that occurs. Or think about what happens when you die. What do you know about what happens when somebody dies? What sets in? Rigor mortis at death. That's due to lack of ATP. So you die, you can't make your ATP anymore. You're not doing cellular respiration or anaerobic pathway, any of those things. Well, your muscles can wind up with the myosin heads attached to the actins, and they can't detach because there's no ATP around to bind to them and cause them to break apart. So that lasts for a little while. Now eventually your actin and your myosin filaments start breaking down in your muscles as you decay, and then rigor mortis goes away. But that's why your muscles stiffen up like that right after you die. That's rigor mortis. Okay, so when you exercise for a long period of time, you develop what's called an oxygen deficit. You need extra O2 after you exercise. We all know this. What do you do after you've been exercising for a while? You're gasping for breath. You're having to take in extra O2. Why? You've got to replenish your oxygen reserves. And we're going to see that gets into myoglobin, a protein in your skeletal muscles that stores O2. Okay, so that is a protein you have in your skeletal muscles that actually binds, absorbs O2, and stores it for you. And you've got to replenish that. O2 is needed actually to help you recreate glycogen. That takes energy. If you take glucoses and bond them together to make glycogen, that is an anabolic reaction. So guess what? You're going to need ATP to power that. Where do you get your ATP? You've got to have O2 to run cellular respiration. You've also got to run cellular respiration to build your ATP and your CP, creatine phosphate reserves back up. So that's why you need all that extra oxygen. Whenever you have a need for O2, think cellular respiration, think ATP, because that's what's going on. And also all that lactic acid you generated from the anaerobic pathway, it takes O2 to convert that back into pyruvic acid. And then pyruvic acid can actually be, you can actually run the reverse of glycolysis. You can take these and convert them back into glucose, and then those can get linked together to build your glycogen. So instead of those types of reactions take energy input, they're going to take ATP to make them happen, and so you need that O2, that extra O2 to run cellular respiration so you can make that ATP. Go away, pen. Okay, another byproduct of muscle activity is heat production. All right, so whenever you do cellular respiration, whenever you break down nutrients, you give off heat. So as nutrients are broken down, we capture some of that energy and store it in the form of ATP, but some of that energy actually gets lost as heat. Now we're pretty good, our skeletal muscles are pretty good at harnessing energy. About 40% of the energy from our nutrients is actually captured and used to make ATP that can power things the cell needs to do, but about 60% of it is lost in the form of heat. Then that gets into thermoregulation. You know, when you're exercising, you've got to be really good. Our bodies have to be good at maintaining body temperature homeostasis. So we radiate that heat out of the body through the skin, and then sweating is also the other thing that we do to help dissipate some of our body heat as well. So you guys know that you get overheated when you exercise, and that's because your skeletal muscles are going crazy breaking down nutrients to supply the ATP that they need. All right, the next lecture we're going to talk about some differences in types of muscle fibers. Now that we've got this background on aerobic versus anaerobic energy pathways in our muscle fibers, we're going to talk about some different types of muscle fibers. You may have heard of this before. You may have heard of slow twitch versus fast twitch muscles, and so we're going to learn what that means in this next video lecture.